I'm Rick Stengel. I'm the editor of Time magazine, and we're delighted to have you here. As a great American historian once said, more Americans get their history from Ken Burns than any other source, and that is why you're a national treasure. Again, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you all. So, the first few questions are about the documentary and about what you've just done. You've been working on it for the last
10 years.
10 years.
Shooting for 6.
Wow. So, all right, here's a tough one. Which national park is your favorite? Tim Worden, Yorba Linda, California.
Well, like your own children, you'd be a bad parent if you had favorites, but I think the parks perform a kind of open heart surgery on people and permit you to have experiences and memories that aren't necessarily tied to their beauty, but tied to your experience of who you saw them with. And Yosemite gave me one of the most powerful and complete experiences I've ever had as a human being. Really rearranged my molecules.
Of all the amazing places you've filmed in our national parks, which are the spots that take your breath away? This is from Heather Neighbors Thompson in Birmingham, Alabama.
It's so hard. They're so varied. You know, you go from the dismal swamp, as someone called the Everglades, which is this amazingly diverse habitat, to the Hawaii volcanoes where they're making new land, to the gates of the Arctic, to Acadia National Park where the first rays of sunlight hit the United States. The view at Yosemite or from the rim of the Grand Canyon. I just, a few weeks ago, took my youngest daughter, who's 4.5, and we climbed up to Delicate Arch in Arches National Park. And I just thought I was on another planet. And I watched this girl who had no idea what a national park was dance with joy as the native peoples must have 10,000 years ago in the space of this beautiful eroded natural sandstone arch. And felt better as a human being.
That's lovely. Parks like the Smoky Mountains, Yellowstone, Grand Canyon are particularly impacted by the huge influx of visitors each year, and many folks have argued that access and preservation are not compatible goals. What is your view on where the balance should be struck between access and preservation?
We think that the parks are the Declaration of Independence applied to the landscape, and there's so much about our democracy that is paradox. These parks were created with the idea that they should be for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. That's in the language, but to be left unimpaired for future generations. And we run the risk of loving them to death. One Park Service director said we could wear out the scenery, and anybody who's been in a traffic jam in Yellowstone knows what I'm talking about. But these are good democratic problems to have. The worst thing, like our vigilance towards liberty, would be that there would be apathy towards these parks, and then our own internal extractive and acquisitive, some would say rapacious nature would come in. That's the part that, you know, looks at a stream and thinks dam, looks at a beautiful stand of timber and thinks board feet, and then we would lose them. So I'd rather be a modern democracy wrestling with how you deal with that contradiction than I would to try to proscribe access to this utterly democratic institution.
Well, it is. I mean, it's a small d democratic
idea. It is indeed.
And you talk a little bit about it there in the introduction. I mean, talk about how the actual idea of it came about.
Well, you know, it's so interesting. The first idea, the first impulse was spiritual. These places are so beautiful. I have had my heart opened to them. And this is the American genius, not just our political freedoms, but our religious freedoms, that we could worship God, not in some dogmatic devotion imposed in a cathedral built by men, but as Ralph Waldo Emerson would say, and Thoreau would echo, and John Muir would further echo, in these cathedrals of nature. And so the first impulses are that. It's only later that it becomes conservation, Teddy Roosevelt, patriotic under Stephen Mather, the first director of the Park Service. He called them vast schoolrooms of Americanism. Later economics drove it. These become engines of local economies for many regions. And now we grapple with complex environmental and ecological issues like climate change. So the parks have had to be this floating thing, but the initial impulse, I think, was so interesting, was people wanted to save it because they thought they could find God more easily there.
What first led you to document stories through film? What was your biggest inspiration when you were a boy and in your early days of directing? Lindsay Smith Hall, Roanoke, Virginia.
My mother died when I was 11. There wasn't a moment when I was alive that she wasn't dying. Several years afterwards, my father, who had a strict curfew, let me stay up late at night to watch movies on TV. And I watched him cry for the first time. He hadn't cried when my mother died. He hadn't cried at the funeral. And I suddenly, at age 13 or 14, realized the huge power of film, that here was the place that he felt he could express emotions. And I vowed right then and there I wanted to be a filmmaker, but I wanted to be a feature filmmaker. So my father and my mother's death were the great goads. And then I went to Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, and all of my teachers were social documentary still photographers, including a great photographer named Jerome Liebling, who became my mentor and reminded me there's much more drama in what is and what was than in anything the human imagination dreams of. And that's how I became a documentary filmmaker, focusing in American history, if only perhaps to wake the dead, one friend of mine told me years later, knowing full well the dead that I really wanted to wake.
This is from Tamara Newman from Bayville, New Jersey. Speaking of documentaries, what is your opinion of Michael Moore's style of documentary filmmaking?
You know, I think he is an extraordinarily talented filmmaker, and I'm always quite concerned when people come up and want to suggest that there ought to be some laws to keep him from doing this. We have a Constitution and a Bill of Rights. He is permitted to say whatever he wants to say and advocate for whatever he wants to advocate. His style is not my style, but just as my style is not his style. So I think we can recognize him as a great propagandist, and for most of the life of documentary films, that's what they've been doing. And it's just degrees of subtlety of that propaganda, if you will. And so I think God bless Michael Moore and anyone else who wants to pick up a camera and try to tell a story. It is a lot harder than you think.